Hi there. Long time no speak. This is Jason Samosa here, and welcome to the ufology moment. If you're a returning listener, you'll notice that there's no highly produced video on screen. If you're a new listener, hi. I'll get to the point fairly quickly. I'm just going to do a short introduction just to say that it's been a little while since I've uploaded. The reason is that, like everyone, I've got a job. And the last video I made, I'm so proud of it, but it took so much time, so much passion to create that final piece. And in the interim months, whilst I've been working away on different stuff, I've reflected and I thought, man, I miss the relentless focus on ufology and the history of UFOs and all of this stuff. But what I've especially realized is I miss the research. I miss communicating the things that I find. I didn't miss the video editing. I'm not going to say that I'm not going to create some really fancy videos again in the future, but for now, I've decided I'm just going to focus on doing my research, sharing what I find in this sort of calm, long content, long format with mistakes like that one, without feeling like I need to edit everything out. So that feels good to me. Now, following from the previous video, I decided there's a lot of unanswered questions about the Tom Delong and John Podesta story. So what you're listening to now is the beginning of a 3-part deep dive on the whole subject. In part 1 today, we're going to look at the key events that took place, and we're going to ask what John Podesta's motivations could have been for introducing the UFO subject into the 2016 campaign election. In part 2, we're going to trace Podesta and the Clintons' interest in UFOs right the way back into the early 90s to look at what was happening during Bill Clinton's time in the White House. And in part 3, we're going to pull the thread of some really interesting UFO activism that happened between the end of the Bill Clinton administration and the beginning of Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency to see what John Podesta was up to. And finally, to make some conclusions about what all of this really means. I really think these events are some of the most fascinating that have occurred in the last 25 years. I really think they represent the lid being opened on something truly unique and occult and astonishing. And so by digging into this little hole that opened up, this little peak that we got inside the halls of power, I think we can discover a lot about what's really going on in the world. The conclusions I'll draw at the end of our 3-part series hopefully will show that what we uncover are some really interesting conclusions about how power works and about what's been going on with UFO disclosure over the last 20 years, and about Podesta and the Clintons themselves. So, with all of that said, let's get started. This is the beginning of a 3-part series, and we better get started with part number 1. If you watched my previous video, you'll have become familiar with the astonishing story of how rock star and amateur ufologist Tom Delong found himself taking meetings with generals, the leadership from Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, and John Podesta, Washington insider and head of Hillary Clinton's campaign for the presidency in 2016. For those of you who haven't watched that video, and you can watch it, it's on the YouTube channel. It's a bit more visually engaging. It's a good watch. I can say that. I'm proud of it. It's a good way to get the foundations. But if you haven't watched it, don't worry. Let me give you the bare bones. About a decade ago, Tom Delong was launching a multimedia franchise. You can listen to interviews he did on Coast to Coast AM in sort of 2014, 2011. He did 2 different interviews where he talks about this idea. Basically, the idea was he wanted to help educate the youth on the UFO phenomenon, its reality, and what he thought it actually meant, the real meaning, purpose, and what was going on behind the curtain, so to speak. He planned to do this through books and documentaries and even integrating his music career, all of this stuff. So as he starts on this journey, he creates a thesis for what he thinks the UFO phenomenon actually is. And he shares it with researchers and aerospace leaders and intelligence people that he's made connections with over the years, I guess off the back of his being a rock star, right? And he gets their feedback. And this eventually leads him to a situation where he's got this kind of group of informal advisors. Basically, through a combination of his serious approach to the topic and also his high ranking status as a celebrity, he was able to actually get some momentum and ended up surrounded by some of the biggest researchers and activists in the field and people who've actually been involved in the topic too. In late 2014, Tom would recruit the author Peter Levender to co-author some of the non-fiction books that he was planning to release. And we know from interviews with Peter Levender that when they first met, Tom already had the bulk of his advisors. Think about that. That was November 2014. So most of the events that people tend to associate with Tom DeLonge and UFOs happened in 2015, 16, 17. But even in late 2014, Levender says that he already had the bulk of his advisors. So people, I assume, based on things I've heard in interviews, people like Hal Puthoff, George Knapp, Gary Nolan, Eric Davis, and a bunch of other people who haven't been officially named in the NRO, the CIA, the NSA, etc. And at this point, Tom's focus is 100% just on creating this multimedia franchise with their input and feedback. Cool. But it's just content, right? He's just got this idea to make this stuff. It's in 2015 that things suddenly get weird. In podcasts from 2015 and 2016, Tom starts to tell these really crazy stories about how he's made contact with these very senior people from the United States government. He says he met one person who introduced him to another person who opened a door to another person, and he eventually gets connected, according to this story, with someone he calls the general, who he claims holds the secrets and the keys, so to speak, to the UFO issue. In these podcasts, Tom sometimes sounds sober, and sometimes he sounds crazy. And this all would have gone down in history as Tom DeLonge got obsessed with UFOs and lost his mind. That's what we all would have ended up thinking, I think, if it were not for a really unique twist of fate. And that is that completely independently of all of this stuff that Tom was doing and the people he claimed to connect with, right? The 2016 election was happening. And the WikiLeaks emails of John Podesta's email server were just put onto the internet for anyone to search. So John Podesta was the campaign chair for the Hillary Clinton campaign. He's going to be a really central figure. In fact, he's the main character we're going to be looking at in this 3-part series. So campaign chair for the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. And his emails were put up on the internet for anyone to search through. Thousands, I think 10,000 or more emails. Now, understandably, in the context of that election, most people were looking through those emails, looking for corruption that Hillary Clinton had been a part of, and things like her Wall Street speeches and the strategy around appeasing Wall Street and all this stuff was brought up in the media right away when these emails were released. But what's really, really interesting is that when people dug in, it didn't take them long to find a string of emails that involved Tom DeLonge and the subject of UFOs. Let me just repeat that. The campaign chair for Hillary Clinton's presidency had a bunch of emails in his email server to and from Tom DeLonge that were about the reality of UFOs. Okay, very interesting. But definitely a thread you want to pull. What's even more interesting, as I explained in the previous video, is that if you go and dig through those emails, you find an invitation to a meeting where 3 gentlemen, let's call them, were invited. And if you do a bit of research, as I show in that previous video, you can identify them as 3 people. There's Robert Weiss, the head of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and executive vice president for Lockheed Martin. So the guy responsible for the most sophisticated, experimental, tip of the spear aerospace research. So if human beings have created what people are perceiving to be UFOs, if those actually come from us, that guy's going to be the person who knows about it. General Michael Carey was another person who was in that invite. He was formerly responsible for the United States Air Force's nuclear response unit. So he was responsible for thousands of staff. And these are the people who are kept up at night because of the threat of a nuclear attack and the need to be able to respond to that attack. And the final person was General Neil McCasland, the former commander of the United States Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a real hotspot for UFO stories, and the former chair of the Special Access Programs Oversight Committee. So this was the guy who was overseeing the special access programs. These are the most sensitive, secret, you only get access to them if you need to have access programs in America. So this is where the most experimental, sensitive stuff is going on in terms of military and defense. Between these three men, they have responsibility, or did at the time, or in that sort of era, responsibility for 20,000 staff, all working on issues at the cutting edge of aerospace and defense, and seemingly had some sort of connection to the UFO issue. Very interesting. Now, firstly, what these emails show is that Tom DeLonge wasn't just bullshitting when he talked about having met these people and been connected to people. He had actually, just by the data in the emails, been connected and was having meetings with these people. It's just a reality, which makes you wonder whether some of the things he was saying, some of the other things, might also have been true. Some of the things about the UFO phenomenon, some strange and quite scary stuff that he talked about in these podcasts. Well, if it turns out that despite sounding crazy, he was actually telling the truth about his connections to people deep in the Department of Defense, is it also possible that he was telling the truth about some things he was saying about the UFO phenomenon, which he said he had been told by very senior people? Very interesting question. Now, alongside this, the emails also show that Podesta had met Tom at some point in kind of spring 2015. And following this, the UFO subject suddenly became quite integral to the Clinton campaign for the White House. Now, you may be listening to this if you're new to the subject and thinking, what are you talking about? And yes, this is actually true. And if you want deeper proof, we'll talk about it in a bit later in this episode, but also the previous video. You can say with absolute confidence, the UFO subject was something that Clinton and Podesta wanted to emphasize in their campaign for the presidency. Actually, if you look at the emails, this is just one example for now. Podesta's staff refer to something that they call the UFO project. Those words are written in an email. They refer to it internally in these emails, the UFO project. This term appears not long after Tom DeLonge has met Podesta. And there's also other email chains that show that Hillary Clinton was preparing for UFO questions during her many media appearances. And in fact, when Jimmy Fallon, I know you weren't expecting Jimmy Fallon to appear in this podcast, but this is how crazy all of this stuff is. When Jimmy Fallon didn't ask the UFO question, the emails show that the comms director says, oh, Hillary was quite upset about that because she was looking forward to it and she'd prepared an answer for that. All very strange. Anyway, that's a high-level summary, okay, of what was happening with Tom DeLonge. And he said he connected with these people, but there is evidence it happened, and we saw these emails. Remarkable. Now, naturally, the first thing that people have done, and I think have continued to do, following this incredible revelation, this bizarre series of emails and this dialogue, that to this day doesn't get enough attention. It's just crazy. But now, naturally, when all this information came out, the first thing that people try and do is they try and pin down everything that Tom said about UFOs from 2015 to 2017. Initially, that stuff was ignored by the vast majority of the population as just some guy who was naive and had got obsessed with UFOs. Now, with the evidence that he was in touch with these very senior people, it's very interesting to look back and say, he was saying A, B, and C, and he was connected to these people. So could it be that those things are true? And I totally get that. And I've spent my fair share of time doing that too. But few people, and I don't mean this as like an accusation, like, well, so people should be doing more research, but I don't think many people pause for long and look at the timeline in the series of events and really ask some of the more tricky questions. And luckily for me, when I was researching the previous video, I had a bit of extra time. So I went deep and I organized well over 100 different events and emails in a sort of a table and really tried to analyze everything forensically to work out what really happened, what was driving various events. Now, on the surface, the story that I've told you and the story that tends to be told is that Tom went to Robert Weiss and to John Podesta, both at different times, and just pitched them his idea for this multimedia sort of franchise. And this is what he says he was doing at the time. And I believe it's what he was doing. He went and pitched this idea. I'm going to release these movies and all of this stuff, and I'm looking for people to advise me. I won't reveal your names, but please share your input, your feedback. And I'm going to create this stuff and just put it out to the public. I'm not going to tell anyone who you are. This was Tom DeLonge's kind of idea for his franchise and how it would involve these very senior people who didn't have to come out to the open. And when Tom DeLonge tells that story, and when people retell that story, sometimes it sounds like, wow, Robert Weiss, the head of the Skunk Works, and John Podesta were so impressed and compelled by Tom DeLonge's pitch and his idea that it triggered them to just really immense action. So for Robert Weiss, that meant he was going to introduce Tom to this person and that person, and suddenly he was speaking to the person who kept all the secrets about UFOs. For John Podesta, it was, wow, this pitch was amazing. I'm going to start a UFO project internally in my campaign team. We're going to start pushing this subject out to the media, and on and on. On the surface, right? That's what it sounds like. Tom pitches this amazing idea, and these people are bowled over and suddenly start triggering interaction, whether that's putting UFOs in the campaign or introducing Tom to the people who hold the secrets of UFOs. But you'll notice that the more I repeat that, the more ridiculous it sounds. That's probably because it is. I don't think it makes any sense. And I actually wonder whether that's actually what Tom intended to say in the first place. Don't get me wrong. I definitely think the following things are 100% true. Tom played a crucial role in the modern UFO disclosure movement. Tom's idea was good. And I can imagine any general who is genuinely concerned about the impact of UFO secrecy and the need to be honest with the American people would see its merits. Tom also brought together many people who previously might not have spoken, and the company that he launched, to the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, became a gravitational focus point for UFO disclosure activism, and that was really key in bringing about major events in 2017 and on that have brought us to where we are today. But despite all of this, I really do not believe that Tom's pitch to these advisors and to John Podesta was really the trigger for any of this. Instead, my thesis is that something else was going on in the background, that Tom's timing was impeccable and exceptional, but that the doors were opened and the dramatic and remarkable events that began to take place were the result of a pre-existing strain of activity, activism, and backroom conversations, rather than his pitch for a multimedia franchise, which of course, the more you say it out loud, the more ridiculous it sounds. There's no way that that pitch could have really triggered all of those enormous things. Something else did. I don't know exactly what that something else was, but over the course of these next few episodes, I think I'll be able to show you that if anyone were to have been in the know in Washington, it would have been John Podesta. I want to take you back in time. It's the 30th of October, 2007. As George Bush Jr.'s second term is just a year away from its conclusion, the Democrats are in the thick of choosing their candidate to fight in the 2008 election. On stage is an all-star selection of the future of the Democratic Party. There's a still coherent Joe Biden. Hillary Clinton is behind a podium too, taking her first punt at the nomination. And a young and still relatively unknown senator named Barack Obama is on stage too. And then there's one more character whose name by this time has been more or less forgotten. Congressman Dennis Kucinich. He'd previously run in 2004, and although he didn't set the world on fire, he'd made a reasonable dent in some states. This time around, with a bit more experience, he was definitely a contender, albeit among some very strong competition. Now, most people do not remember Dennis Cucinich, but for those who do, it'll be for one thing. On that night, in October 2007, as he stood on stage, he had a bit of a swagger in his pose. He had an easy smile, an unfazed expression in his eyes that oozed a kind of presidential sophistication. Until the host suddenly asked him a question that he wasn't expecting.
Congressman Cucinich, I want to move to a different area because this is a serious question. The godmother of your daughter, Shirley MacLaine, writes in her new book that you cited a UFO over her home in Washington State, that you found the encounter extremely moving, that it was a triangular craft, silent and hovering, that you felt a connection to your heart and heard directions in your mind. Now, did you see a UFO?
I did, and the rest of the account, I didn't. It was unidentified flying object. Okay, it's like it's unidentified. I saw something. Now, to answer your question, I'm moving my. And I'm also going to move my campaign office to Roswell, New Mexico, and another one in Exeter, New Hampshire. Okay. And also, you have to keep in mind that Jimmy Carter saw a UFO, and also that more people in this country have seen UFOs and I think approve of George Bush's presidency.
Actually,
and so wait, we're just getting started here.
No. I mean, we have about 14% of Americans say they have seen UFOs. I'm going to move.
What was the percentage?
14%.
What was that percentage?
14.
Thank you.
I want to see. I'm going to ask Senator Obama a question in the same line.
Now, no matter how much Kucinich tried to save it at the end there, and I think he actually did a reasonably good job for someone who definitely was flustered, it wasn't a perfect answer. And you could tell that he struggled a bit with that question and was caught off guard. It doesn't help as well that an audience who have been trained to think that UFOs are laughable did exactly what they're supposed to do, which is laugh at this subject, which had a huge stigma over it. It still does, but today, obviously, laughter about UFOs is in recession. But in 2007, the stigma surrounding UFOs was in full force. And it's very interesting as well that Cucinich, he's not running on a UFO platform, right? He doesn't have any policies about UFOs. He didn't even want to make UFOs a campaign issue at all. All that happened was he had an experience that was written about in a book that had just been released at the time. And he even qualifies and says, look, we don't know what it was. It's an unidentified flying object. And still, it just led the audience to laughter. It made him look silly. It's very strange how this all happens, the psychology of human beings. But somehow he lost in that situation, despite the fact that he was just describing events in a book, not on stage, in a book that for him were real and significant. The next day, the headlines started to roll in. And granted, look, he wasn't necessarily winning the Democratic nomination, but that was a real turning point for his campaign. And by January, his numbers were so bad, he was actually excluded from a critical MSNBC debate. Now, why are we talking about Cucinich? Well, it gives us a really useful reference point. We can see how attaching the UFO issue to a presidential campaign can make a candidate a laughingstock and hurt their election. So ask yourself, what on earth, pun intended, were Podesta and Clinton thinking by making UFOs a central fixture of their campaign in 2016? I mean, sure, it's 9 years later, and the world had changed a lot. But UFOs were still an easy way to get laughs in the media. Jokes about tinfoil hats and labels of conspiracy theory were still enough to discredit a person. But they still made it a massive issue. Let me list out the facts for you. The events, the emails, the timeline, the media appearances to show you just how much Clinton and Podesta weren't just talking about UFOs, they were pushing the topic. First, August 17th, 2015. WikiLeaks emails reveal an internal staffer describing the UFO project. That's literally what it says in the email. Link in the description. September 24th, 2015. Podesta gets an email from Tom DeLong, forwarded on from General Neil McCasland, that drafts a White House memo on UFOs. So that is a general from the Air Force who is drafting what the White House should say to begin a conversation about UFOs when Clinton is elected. That was September 2015. Just 5 days later, following Lena Dunham's interview with Hillary Clinton, Podesta retweets her saying, "Great interview, Lena Dunham, but Lena, ask her about aliens next time." Okay, this is in front of all of Lena Dunham's followers and all of Podesta's followers. So this isn't a backroom conversation. This is out in the open. A week later, November 6th, 2015, the WikiLeaks emails show Podesta asking Christina Sheikh, former special assistant to Obama and comms director for the 2016 Clinton campaign, "How is Jimmy Kimmel?" To which she replies without any prompting from Podesta, She was charming, got lots of laughs, worked in a lot of message, including climate change. He didn't end up asking her about UFOs. She was very disappointed. She practiced UAPs for 5 minutes beforehand. Now, that is astonishing. Okay, so an internal comms director, firstly, the fact that Hillary Clinton was practicing a subject on UFOs, at the time still described as UFOs, but in the email, Christina Sheikh refers to them as UAPs, which is very interesting because that term wasn't out in the open yet. So the Podesta campaign had obviously decided they were going to rebrand UFOs into UAPs. That's a very interesting point in and of itself. But more interesting is that without any prompting, Christina Sheikh feeds back to Podesta that UFOs were not included in the dialogue, because that's clearly what Podesta wanted. That's what Christina Sheikh was hoping for. That's what Hillary Clinton had practiced for. The entire campaign was synced on this thing. Just a month later, as 2015 was closing out, Clinton is interviewed for the Conway Daily Sun, where she pledges that she's going to get to the bottom of the UFO issue and thinks we may already have been visited by aliens. Now into 2016, on the 24th of March, on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, Clinton talks openly about UAPs and talks about the need to get to the bottom of the issue. Just 2 weeks later, she does the same on the Breakfast Club, and then on the 10th of May 2016, Clinton does a piece with the New York Times and is extremely open about her plan to, quote, open the files. 3 weeks later, May 27th, 2016, she does the same on MSNBC. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. This is not just about her sharing her opinion here or there. This is a plan, an internal communication strategy that her comms director and Podesta's internal staff all know about. A UFO project. That's the term that was used in the emails with no need for an explanation, apparently, because clearly Podesta already knows what that refers to. And it involves getting the UFO issue onto the agenda across the world's biggest media platforms, whether that's the New York Times, MSNBC, Kimmel, Fallon, or even just on Twitter, being relentlessly open and public about it. Now, given that the UFO issue was a key component in the downfall of the Dennis Kucinich campaign, and that this happened literally right in front of Hillary Clinton as they stood on stage together, isn't it astonishing? And in fact, I would go further. Isn't it absurd and almost impossible to rationalize that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta have now decided to make UFOs a critical and central component of their campaign? I mean, isn't that crazy? The more you think about it, the more it doesn't make any sense. And I think with this context, we can begin to reach out to some informal conclusions here. I don't think that John Podesta and Hillary Clinton would have done this if they didn't have some sort of indicator, some other kind of information that we don't have access to, that made them feel like this is a moment when we can do this. Cucinich is our model for what happens when you so much as get associated with the UFO issue, right? He wasn't running on a UFO platform. He wasn't talking about opening the books or saying we may already have been visited by UFOs. He didn't do any of this. His experience was simply reported in a book, and that hurt him massively. Here's Podesta and Clinton. They're not just talking about it. They are running on this issue. And this constitutes both an external communication strategy, but also an internal dialogue that's going on as well. It's coordinated. And that raises the question, what happened that made them feel so comfortable and confident running on this issue? This is what I am fascinated with, and it'll be the question that we're tackling throughout this whole series. As I've pondered on this, there is one theory that lingered with me briefly, and it's something that's worth looking at. What if they just felt really confident that they were going to win? And so they felt like, look, we can actually pursue this topic that we really care about, even though it might hurt us slightly in the polls. Let's just put this front and center because we care about it and we're obviously going to win. There's no way anyone else is going to win. And, Hillary Clinton's favorability rating wasn't great, but in 2015, her polling was very good. So maybe Podesta and Clinton just thought, stuff it. We're going to win. Let's start to focus on this thing that we really care about. Well, let's think about that. Outside of my interest in UFOs, I work in the world of cybersecurity and technology, usually for companies that are growing really fast. And my role is on the marketing side, so I hold a relatively senior role in a tech company today. That's what I do outside of all of this stuff. And the company that I work for, like others that I've been a part of, is gunning for a very big goal. We want to massively grow the company to prove ourselves to be a leader in the market, and there's certain numbers associated with that. Those goals and those targets that we're trying to hit are incredibly ambitious. We plan to get there in 3 to 4 years. And to achieve that, we have a huge mountain to climb. We basically need to grow the business by about 400% over the course of those years. Massive mountain to climb, and we have competitors too. Now, in my role, I'm responsible for the messaging. So I get to decide, well, I don't get to decide everything, but my key contribution to the team and the thing that I help everyone work out is how do we position ourselves and make sure that we have a really competitive position, and we're talking maximum value to our customers. Now, for whatever my experience is worth, let me share something with you. We don't take unnecessary risks. We do what's required to win. Now, look, if there's a small decision that has very small consequences, sure, let's experiment. Let's learn from those small decisions, and maybe we fail, but that's fine because we've learned something, and then we can apply that learning next time we come to a similar junction. But on a big scale, we're not going to create strategies just based on personal interests. For example, I have personally a very big concern about big tech monopolies and about the capitalization of artificial intelligence. Despite caring massively about those issues, they don't feature in our marketing strategy. My point is that when you have big ambitions in this world, whether it's in the world of technology or not, you reduce your risk profile. You don't take unnecessary risks, and you certainly don't associate yourself with topics that people may look down on you for. Now, another example, let's skip over to politics. As I record this, it's midway through 2024. And here in the UK, the Labour Party is polling very well, and the Conservative Party is falling apart. Those two things are definitely connected. Despite this, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, a man being described as the Prime Minister in waiting, refuses to take any risks with his messaging, and I mean any. He refuses to criticize the Israeli state's actions in Gaza. He's renounced his pledge to invest $28 billion to solve the climate crisis. He's not stepping away from any of the norms of the 21st century's neoliberal philosophy. Despite being the Labour leader, there's absolutely no conversations about democratic reform. For those of you in the US, by the way, you may forget this, but in the United Kingdom, our upper chamber and our head of state are completely unelected. Even our democratically elected House of Commons, those people are allowed to get second jobs, changing their interests as a first past the post, blah, 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 blah. All of these things massively reduce the effect of democracy in our country. And yet the left-wing Labour Party leader has shown no interest in committing to any reform there. If elected, he's promised that he will not undo the highly controversial new oil and gas licenses that the Tory party has approved. And he's abandoned any significant increase in taxation on the wealthy and billionaires, and has even gone so far as to praise Margaret Thatcher. So what's going on here? Well, Keir Starmer is de-risking. He's sending a message to all of the key power players, the defense and intelligence community, the UK establishment, the monarchy, the lords, the banks, the oil and gas industry, and the very sizable conservative-leaning population here in the United Kingdom. He's sending a message to all of them that, hey, this is just like a diet Tory party, okay? Nothing to be scared of here. I'm not going to challenge the status quo. There's no risk. You can vote for me. You can let me come into power, and all of the things that you currently like will remain pretty much the same. Don't worry. The point I'm making here is whether you're involved in business or politics, whenever you have big ambitions, you don't take unnecessary risks. In the case of Dennis Cucinich, he didn't even signal any policy initiative around UFOs. He just said he saw a UFO in a book, and he was made a mockery of. So even if Clinton was ahead in the polls, why would they talk openly about this? And sure, they have a private interest in this, and we'll talk about that later on in the next part of the series. But why would you make this a part of your election campaign? Surely, if you were going to end up talking about this and running some kind of activism around the subject, you would do that after people had voted. Why risk turning people off? Why give yourself a topic that your opponents could use against you? What was Clinton thinking? What was Podesta doing? None of this makes any sense if you look at things through the normal lens of political strategy. And this brings me to my thesis. The UFO project, by the way, I'm going to use this to refer to what Podesta and Clinton were doing, their communication strategy, and this huge emphasis they were putting on this. This UFO project was not triggered by Tom's multimedia franchise concept. And I hope by now that my prolonged diatribe has convinced you of this. The risks of attaching UFOs to a presidential campaign are much too big. And Tom's multimedia project, although pretty cool, was nowhere near compelling enough to drive all of that. My thesis is that it was caused by something else, some other strain of communication that we, the public, do not have access to, but which you can pick bits out of if you dig deep enough. And in the rest of this series, I want to spend some time trying to pull on that thread and that strain of activism and dialogue that I think has been going on since the 90s, and that you can reasonably track and trace all the way through the Obama administration into this moment that we've been dissecting. But before we dig into Podesta in earnest, I just want to deal with one more theory that might be on your mind. It certainly was on my mind for a little while. Yes, it doesn't make any sense to say that Tom was the trigger behind this UFO project in the Podesta campaign. But what about General Neil McCasland and his cohort? What about Michael Carey and Robert Weiss and these people? If you remember from my previous video, Podesta met with them in January 2016 at the behest of Tom DeLong. Isn't it possible that these men sparked this huge enthusiasm, this UFO project? The answer is no. And here's the first reason. It's clear from the WikiLeaks emails that McCasland didn't speak openly about UFOs on the call that he had with John Podesta. Tom followed up the call with an email to Podesta saying he mentioned he's a skeptic. Here, Tom is referring to General Neil McCasland because he's subtitled the email McCasland, very subtle. He mentioned he's a skeptic. He's not. I've been working with him for 4 months. I just got done giving him a 4-hour presentation on the entire project a few weeks ago. Trust me, the advice is already happening on how to do all of this. He just has to say that out loud, but he is very, very aware, as he was in charge of all the stuff. What's absolutely fascinating about this email is it shows two things. Firstly, it implies that Podesta and McCasland don't really have a relationship or a connection. Or at the very least, even if they possibly do, McCasland wasn't comfortable speaking openly with John Podesta about the topic. And if that's the case, then this idea that McCasland might have been sharing information with Podesta seems pretty unlikely. And if you follow the email chain after this meeting, you'll see that Robert Weiss from Skunkworks, when he wants an update from Podesta, he doesn't ask Podesta himself. He asks Tom, who then emails Podesta saying, hey, if you have an update for Mr. Weiss, I'd really appreciate it. If not, then that's fine. Which shows you once more that Podesta doesn't have an independent line of communication with these people. So this idea that there was some sort of dialogue going on between the two of them, I don't think is an idea that has much merit. Also, it's really interesting to note the sense of urgency and action in that email that Tom sent too. This idea that the advice is already happening on how to do all of this. That's a quotation we'll refer back to at the end of this series. So this idea that this UFO project was actually driven and came from McCasland and his connections, I think is not feasible. But actually there's an even more fundamental issue, which is the timeline. The Podesta team were already talking about the UFO project on August 17th, 2015. That's a full 162 days before the McCasland meeting. So, with that theory very thoroughly put to bed, where did all of this come from? Where did Podesta's sudden openness and enthusiasm to talk openly about this UFO issue and the confidence to do it despite knowing the history of how this topic has brought people down, where did this clarity and enthusiasm come from? Well, to answer that question, we have to scroll back. Back before Podesta and Clinton were running for the White House in 2015 and 2016. All the way back to another Clinton's journey into the White House in the 90s. Well, thanks very much for listening to this first episode of this series. For anyone who is a returning listener, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be making content again, and I'm excited to continue in this format. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the slightly more laid back, long form style of this. For me, I think this is where I'm most comfortable, actually. And I'm really excited to share parts 2 and 3 with you. Look, I don't think I'm going to share anything that's going to turn the UFO world on its head, but I really think that the full story I'm going to share with you will show that the world is really complicated. Power isn't centralized. And the UFO issue continues to be utterly bizarre. It always has been, and it always will be, a source of immense curiosity for anyone who takes the time to scratch that initial layer off. It's strange. In the next episode, we're going to be heading right back to the 90s to pass out the roots of Podesta's and the Clintons' UFO activism. And following that piece, we'll be looking beyond those years too. When we reach the final conclusion, I hope that you'll be looking at all of this with new eyes. But for now, my name's Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time, cheers.